So one of the developments recently has been reasoning LLMs. I'm not going to dive into it but too particularly, but I just want to let people know that these models come about through a little bit of a training process and a little bit separate part when we're doing predictions, where instead of just giving you the prediction, it tries over and over to think, reason, gives another prediction. Is that the right prediction or not? And it kind of has a little bit of a loop like that, which means inference takes a little bit longer. And that's how kind of reasoning models have been working. But these reasoning models, because they do multiple predictions, you can see those intermediate reasoning steps. It's very intriguing, very insightful. But I'll tell you right from the beginning, you can't always trust exactly what's going on in those intermediate reasoning steps. Really, what the model's trying to do is find a way to get to that output in a correct way. Now, to give you some insight on how we got here and kind of how these models work is, if you remember the first generation of these large language models, we had done this instruction fine-tuning where often we gave examples of the model where if I was, for example, working on sentiment, we might give examples like this where we show it, hey, here's some text, here's the sentiment that comes out. And the model learns really easily to then be able to identify some new type of text and be able to identify the sentiment like that. This is often called kind of the instruction tuning we did for large language models, and it's what allowed large language models to be very good at many of these tasks like this that we gave it training data. And again, remember, large language models are defined by their training data, what examples that they've seen before. If they've seen these sentiment examples, they're very good. In fact, they're kind of state of the art in being able to detect sentiment as a general basis. Now, so how do you get these models to reason, to think step by step, to sometimes come up with a plan and then a detailed steps of what they should do? Well, you give them training data, you give them examples. So this is just one example of a training data set that I popped up. There's many more out there, but what I really wanted to point out here is what we're doing now is teaching models that, hey, we want you to go through a detailed planning process to do this. And then we give them training examples where, as you see on this in this example on the right, it goes in a step-by-step process all the way through solving the problem. So this is one of the biggest changes that we've had over the last year, 18 months, is now we're starting to give models this much more complicated training data, and in response, models are able to do these multi-step problems as well. And remember, at the end of the day, these models are governed by their training data. They're not necessarily going to learn anything out there original by themselves like that. So that's the models, that's the reasoning models. Now, the providers such as OpenAI, Anthropic, you can use the DeepSeek open source models as well, have now made these models available to us so we can start using them very easily. One that came out about 2 months ago is Claude's model that allows extended thinking. And what I like about this extended thinking is it's not only kind of carefully thinking about a problem, it also combines it with tool use, which means now I can get the thinking, but I can pair it with a tool like I want to go out and search the internet, or as we'll use here, a tool to go out and search my RAG database or connect to other APIs. So it just allows all that reasoning to become much more powerful by bringing in other parts as well. Now, to use this extended thinking inside of Claude, they've made it very simple, where if you're using that latest model, all you have to do is kind of tell it, hey, enable the thinking. And there's some constraints around budgets and other pieces like that. And then what's going to happen is when the model has an activity, it's going to show you all the intermediate tokens, but it's also, you can set this, as you'll see, in somewhat of a loop fashion where it will continue thinking about the problem until it feels like it has solved the problem as well. So that's kind of the thinking models. Let's jump into kind of using them now. I've put together a notebook which has all the different code snippets that I've used to do this. But let me back up. In the past, when I've built different kind of solutions, done YouTube videos, I've wanted you to go and run the notebook as a companion. the world has changed a lot nowadays. You don't need to go and kind of run that exact notebook to be able to use this. Anthropic has well documented exactly how to use this. If you're using any modern code generation tool, you can feed it that documentation page. It can easily write the code for you. So please don't feel wedded to have to use my code. There's plenty of ways to be able to do this without that. Now, let's walk through this code. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Now, again, in full disclosure, I work for Contextual AI. Contextual AI has a RAG tool. So often, kind of one of the things I'm doing with the code is not necessarily using like a search engine as a tool for an AI researcher. I'm using the RAG engine like that. And typically the workflow I'm going is, I want to take advantage of the model's thinking ability to generate a plan. Say I'm asking it to do an analysis of a company. Well, depending on what sector it is, Claude has a good idea of how maybe I might analyze a company, a financial services company versus a telecommunications company, and has a sense of what questions I should be able to ask. So I want to take advantage of Claude's native ability to think and plan how to do a research project like that. But then I'm going to pair it, in this case, with our RAG solution because I want to show customers how they can use that. You could easily modify this if you wanted to, for example, search the internet, search some other place as well. And I'll point that out as I go through that, but don't get thrown off when you see the contextual AI calls here as well. So now what I want to do is I want to walk through the first example of this and kind of how I did this. Now, when I wrote this, I didn't write line by line. This was actually one of my first experiences using Cursor to be able to kind of vibe code or write this out. And I will tell you right away, it was a little frustrating using Cursor. One of the issues is that this is a new feature that's in Claude. It just came out 2 or 3 months ago. So Cursor, if you natively ask the questions, it's connecting to the Claude model, doesn't know about thinking mode, and it pushes you back to older versions, other versions of Claude that doesn't have that, which is frustrating. So you have to make sure you give it the latest documents if you want to use these generation tools. The other thing is, break this up into smaller pieces when you're doing this as well. That can be a lot less frustrating. So the code I've written here is I want it to be able to write these research reports that I've done. And so in this case, the first version of this, I wanted to dynamically kind of give it a bunch of different companies and it would be able to write out the research to do that. So you'll see at the beginning here, I have some different requests to do. These are the different kind of search engines, search requests that I wanted to do like that I was testing out. Now, in this first version, when I first built it out, I didn't really understand what was going on. I got some outputs and it was doing some things, but it wasn't clear to me exactly what was happening and all the steps that were going on, kind of because I used this vibe coding and it generated 200 tokens of code in these loops. So one of the things I did was, as part of it, I asked it to add a bunch of print statements in, as well as track all the token usage going through the researcher. This, as you'll see the output in a little bit, gave me a lot of insights because that allowed me to trace and understand exactly what the model was doing at various steps. And so if you're not building the code section by section, I highly encourage you, if you're using these generation tools like Cursor, to explicitly kind of ask it to add all this print statements, add all of this stuff. It bulks up the code, but it helps you really understand what's going on. So a couple of things I want to point out as I'm going through this. You'll see, for example, here with the Claude call, I use stream. If you start writing longer reports, you're going to want to use streaming because that allows the tokens to kind of continue going. You're not just having to wait for it to write all of that and pass it through. Claude will warn you and even tell you, hey, when you're writing longer things, you should think about using streaming. Now, when these models work, they're spending time thinking about what they're going to planning and doing. So one of the things that you have to add is kind of the budget tokens, how much time you want it to spend thinking to do that. I always put like 2,000, 4,000 for my tasks. That was enough, but just something for you to kind of keep in mind as you do this. And then, of course, my favorite thing about this is we can define tools with this. So I can have it query, in this case, kind of supply and financial data along with this piece as well. So that's essentially the thinking piece that we had to do. Now, the way I kind of wrote this, because I wanted to write something that would write a report. The way the code is, if you look at this, is there's an initial plan that's done. Then there's a loop. And you can see here, I needed to make sure what was going on in the loop. I even counted iterations. There's a loop here where we're going to use the tools. So as it's going through the tool use, it's keeping track of all the tokens that's happening, right? Adding the tool results. You'll see the prompting is if we need to continue analysis, we're going to prompt it, hey, continue your analysis for the remaining companies if you have multiple companies here going on. Being able to keep all that piece in mind as it's kind of working through, being able to kind of solve the model until it's thinking, until it's finally done, and then it passes back that final message, right? That final analysis back into me, so then we can kind of analyze all of that. So this was my first kind of take at this. It worked nicely. It allowed me to kind of get a sense of what was going on through all this. But then, right, as you'll see kind of through this, I tweaked this a number of different ways. None of these are necessarily the right way to do it, but as you start working on any project, you're going to do things in different ways. So I wanted to build, the next version I wanted to build is now that I understood what was happening, and let me pause here. This is what it looked like when I was doing this, where I could see, hey, the initial prompt call token. What's the thinking that Claude is doing? What's the response? Here's the query. So this was really cool. Before I went on, this is really what helped me understand exactly what was going on for that. And you can see all the different query calls that we were doing here to look up, to build all the pieces that we needed for the final report. In this case, I was analyzing kind of Microsoft and Apple. I can keep track of all that. Again, like the first time you do something, for me, this is key to really make sure I can intuitively understand what's going on through that. And then based on that, I could just clean up that output that was there. I could take a look, and this is what, for example, if you run that code, you throw in Microsoft and Apple, this is what you'll see is you'll get a report, something like this, that's well structured out, that helps you understand all the differences. And in this case, using the data from the tools to do that. Now, let's go to that cleaned up version. So I wrote that version, and then I was like, okay, well, before I kind of share this out with the team, I need to get rid of all the print statements. I don't want to look like I'm doing it that way. And so this version, you'll see, I've slimmed it down, where I've tried to clean out all the excessive parts and just really keep the focus part of, hey, what I want to do is, for example, in this case, compare the R&D strategies of these companies. I have my initial call here. Then we're going to go through, once we have that initial plan, we're going to set the iterations. And I have things like max iterations, just in case it goes crazy and wants to call my tool too many times. I can do that. We see the blocks here where it's going to go through, continually call that agent, right? Looking up all that relevant supply data for me until it generates the final report. And then that final report is outputted. So that worked out. That helped me clean it up a little bit. But I noticed when I actually looked at what I ended up sending the team, it was a little bit different. And so I want to show you all kind of what that was too, because this is just the change over time to do this. And to tell you the truth, nowadays with these code generation tools, it gets very easy to kind of change and update these things as well. So the next version I did was, all right, well, I used the RAG search, but maybe I want to use web search. So I used Tavily, which is a client for doing internet research that works well with LLMs. And so I kind of beefed up my AI researcher kind of with this. You'll see here the code. In this case, I I pasted in this notebook, but the earlier versions I did them all inside a notebook because I was kind of iterating, working my way through. But the script here you'll see is in the cell is a complete script end to end, because when I worked with my team, they just wanted the Python file. They didn't want to walk through kind of a long notebook to solve this type of problem. So let's walk through this code, and you'll see there's some differences here. We've got it a little bit nicely formatted here, where you'll see exactly kind of what's the pieces that's coming out. Things are defined up front here for what we're doing. I have my queries tools. This is my query for RAG. What are the tools I use? Second, I have the Tvili tool, which kind of uses their search API. You can use many other tools out there, but this was just so I can do that combination of that. And so now what I wanted to do is I needed my prompt now to understand that you're going to use your research assistant doing this, but you can use both RAG search and Tvili search to do it. One of the other things you'll see in this is here I've been very systematic about telling it the process that the research assistant should work in. It's six of one, half a dozen the other. Sometimes I've done this, I've built the same agent where I've let the model itself decide what is the plan and how to do it. What I found generally is often I have some ideas, my customers have some ideas of what the final plan should look like. And instead of just letting the model do what it wants itself, I'm better off if I give it a bit of structure on how I want the research written. So you'll see here, I've done a lot more kind of structure here for what it should do in that prompting piece. So that was a lesson I learned along the way. All right, so let's continue on. Now when we see the tools, I've defined a kind of tools with both the query RAG, the RAG query, as well as Tvili. This is what's going to be passed into Claude like that into the tools we have. So now we have Claude doing an initial analysis where I use that prompt. I remember like, hey, generate a plan, do all of these pieces like that. The temperature is set up high. You have to actually set that with thinking mode. You need a little bit higher of a temperature. You can't use 0, for example, like that. But hopefully the idea is it comes up with some creative plans here to be able to do that. And one of the nice things about Claude is you can see the intermediate tokens. You can see that thinking plan as we went through this. And so I like to see it as well. And again, I remind people that research has shown that these models aren't thinking in the same way as the humans. The thinking is just some text that's generated. So it's not necessarily, the thinking doesn't necessarily correlate or is causation with the final output. So always take the thinking with a grain of salt like that. So then we go through, we have kind of the loops here for kind of the tool calling that we're going to be able to do, the searches like that. I've set the iterations here again to 30. You can set it for kind of different pieces like that. As it goes through the loop, right? Like what additional information? Like, hey, go use these tools, go solve part of the problem, but then think about what other information you need. Let's see kind of what comes back from that. And again, kind of printing out all the intermediate tokens as we go through this. Then finally, excuse me. Finally, this is a little bit different than the other ones where it would write the report as it was thinking through. Here, I have it collect all the information and then write the report. So you'll see the prompt here, right? Based on all the information that you've gathered, put together this report, with your research process, key decisions, findings, conclusions, all of that. Adding this clarity, again, allowed me to steer the report to kind of what I wanted to do it. Because part of it is I had a customer that had a certain piece that wanted this. Using Stream again, I want to be able to handle and print out these larger reports with that. So that allowed me to kind of do that, as well as the thinking. So this was very much nicer. You can see this very much nicer structured, where I had all the things and functions. I can then write out and do the calls on this. So much cleaner code, all in Python as well. That was done. I'll use the Anthropic's client. So this is what the output of that final research kind of script writes along that, where I get a research report where I can see the thinking process that's going through. So this is all the stuff the model was thinking about how it should be doing it, all that information I gave it for kind of the step-by-step piece to do that. Next, I can see all the information that was gathered. Part of this was, again, like I wanted to see what are the queries that we're doing. The report has all that information here. I'm going to scroll all the way to the end here because there's a lot of pieces there where I can see all the queries that were pulled, right, where they were sources, where they were pulled on. Then, remember I had that final section. Now I can see that final analysis and recommendations where I saw the thinking process for organizing all of that information. And then now it's condensed all the way through into putting together the key process decisions and findings of this. So this is how I was able to kind of put together the final report that I wanted to do like this, that gave me a nice long report with very good analysis in a structured process that I wanted to do that way. Really happy with this. It took a while to get through this, through all those steps that I did that. But here's the key. This is what I did for a particular project, kind of using straight Python and Anthropic. But if you're working on this, I got something else I want to show you that might be a little bit cleaner for some of the problems that you're working on. So let's get this out of the way. So what I want to introduce you to is a framework that you can use to be able to do these reasoning problems. Now, frameworks are controversial. Frameworks end up abstracting a lot of complexity away. So as you'll see, we're going to go from those hundreds of lines I have to a much smaller amount. Sometimes that doesn't work out well if the underlying technology is moving and the framework isn't able to stay up with it. So this is where I caution people when kind of using frameworks to understand exactly what they're doing, how well that framework is staying up with pieces like this. So when you're thinking about like how you want to implement it, I'm not saying that 100% go to Agno and implement everything, but especially if you're just dipping your toe into these models and you want to just try them out and get a sense of what they are, well, instead of spending like an hour and a half kind of doing all that coding like I did, you can go pretty easily and use Agno's frameworks that really support reasoning models. And this is why I kind of was attracted to Agno, besides kind of a good reputation for as a high quality framework. It's been able to adapt to these reasoning models and include them in their framework. So for example, we saw that earlier where I used this Claude 7. Well, look at how compact the code is. I can then use the thinking tools. I can use different tools, putting that all together instead of all those lines of code that I had for writing a researcher. So I tried Agno, and I wanted to show you kind of how that worked out for writing a research assistant that way. So this is the code that I used for Agno. I basically installed their package very easily. There's just a few pieces I needed around Anthropic and reasoning that I pulled in. Now, again, I was using my own tool here. With Agno, it was very easy to be able to define that tool. I just wrote this simple function that went from the query that I had to what the output should be for that. So this is important to me because I like the flexibility of knowing that I can easily add other tools into the package. Then to write my researcher, all I needed to do was just tell it, hey, give it some instructions for what you're supposed to do. Like, I want you to use your tools to write it. I want you to kind of answer the question. And for the reasoning tools here, I added get contextual results, which is the name of that function, the tool that I pulled in. I wanted to, of course, use the reasoning tools and show the instructions. And then in terms of the query, I just said, hey, compare the market caps of all of these companies. Give me a detailed analysis of this. We're doing internal work on thinking models at contextual. So this was a query I was trying against different versions of models like that. And then I just had the reasoning agent go through and do this. So as you can see, pretty compact. I defined a tool, right? A line of code. I mean, all of this in my notebook when I ran this was less than 30 lines of code. Pretty impressive. So let me now show you kind of the results of what came out of that. So here's my cursor output, and I'm hoping I'm not showing anything too revealing in this. When I printed this out, when I ran this with Agno, it has some nice kind of helpers for a notebook that kind of allow you to visualize everything right inside the notebook in terms of the thinking and reasoning steps. So you'll see this, all this kind of formatting that came with Agno, where I was able to see as soon as I ran this, what was my initial query. Then I could see, hey, here's the reasoning step the model did, the first step, the second step. Oh, right now it has to gather some information. It's going to make tool calls here. See, it even tells you it's making tool calls for what's doing it. So it's going and grabbing that out. All these reasoning steps are well documented using Agno. So I like this. It even told me all the different tool calls that were happening as well. So again, like if you remember back, like I spent hours like building all that stuff myself. It was nice to have it already built into a framework for me. And then it went ahead, took about 85 seconds, wrote me that final report here as well. So I could get the comparisons of market capitalizations, right, based on the latest information as well. Then get my detailed analysis, nicely formatted report for what I wanted to do. And for what I was looking for, I was very happy with the quality of this report. And I want to remind people again, like this was a pretty easy process by taking advantage of the thinking models. And let's look at that code one more time, right? By taking advantage of the thinking models where I gave it a tool, I gave it some instructions, and that was it to do that. Of course, and passed it, of course, the query that I wanted to do that. So I was very impressed. So if you're just dipping your toes into this area, I would heavily kind of recommend trying out Agno for that. It's an easy way to kind of try out these models as well. So to wrap this up, I'm going to share out this notebook here. But again, the point of this is not the notebook. I want you to understand what reasoning models are, when you should start to use them. Anytime you need these extended thinking where you're doing things in a step-by-step, you should consider using them. It's easy to test to see, are you getting lift or not to do that? If you want to use them, there's a number of API providers have thinking models out there. They're not that hard to get started with, either just using it directly from the API provider, such as kind of what we did here with Anthropic, adding your own little bit of code around that, whether you want to orchestrate that, whether you want to document that. I think the first time through really helps you understand what's going on. But we also have these frameworks as well that work, that abstract away. And of course, with Agno, I just really mentioned this about the reasoning, but of course, this Agno, for example, has lots of other tools that are built in that you can use, as well as lots of other functionality depending on what you're doing for agentic places like that. But go out, try these models. I think it's a really exciting development. I'm looking forward to watching them mature. Thanks, everyone.